It all started on a stormy night, wind howling, trees swaying, and lightning dancing across the sky. I was working from home, relying on my internet to stay connected during a critical project deadline. Then, right in the middle of a video call, everything froze. My internet was cut. At first, I thought it was just a storm. But when I checked with a few neighbors and saw their Wi-Fi working fine, something didn't add up. That's when I got the message that made my blood boil. The HOA? Yes. The very homeowners association that's been meddling in things they don't understand had shut off my internet on purpose during a storm, claiming some ridiculous community bandwidth control excuse. What? They didn't. No. The signal they so casually cut off actually comes from a tower I own. That's right time, not just another resident. I'm the one who built the local relay setup that half the neighborhood piggybacks off of, including the HOA office itself. They had no clue they'd just bitten the hand that feeds them, and during a dangerous weather emergency, no less. This wasn't just about inconvenience. This was about safety, control, and a serious overreach of authority. I had receipts, contracts, and ownership papers to prove everything. But instead of going off right away, I decided to play it smart, a little bit petty. What came next was a series of moves that not only exposed their entitled behavior, but left them scrambling to fix what they broke. And believe me, it got messy real fast. So, how does a power-hungry HOA react when they find out the internet tower they tried to control doesn't even belong to them? Stay tuned, because the fallout was something they never saw coming. Let me back up a bit so you understand just how wild this situation really was. I moved into this neighborhood a few years ago, mostly because it looked peaceful and had decent infrastructure. But I quickly realized the HOA here wasn't your average neighborhood group. They loved their rules paint colors, mailbox height, even what kind of lawn chairs you could have. I usually kept my head down and stayed out of their way. But when I noticed the internet speeds in the area were garbage and unreliable, especially during storms, I decided to fix that. I work in tech, so I partnered with a small ISP to build a private signal relay tower on a nearby plot I owned. It wasn't flashy, just a small setup that quietly boosted internet to several homes, including mine. Over time, more people started using it. I didn't even charge much. I just wanted reliable service and helped a few neighbors who were struggling with remote work and school. Even the HOA office started routing their service through it. Funny thing is, they never even asked where the improved signal was coming from. Typical. Fast forward to the storm night. I later found out that during a board meeting, yes, they actually held a meeting while the power flickered and trees nearly came down. Someone suggested they shut down unnecessary bandwidth drains. Apparently, I'd been labeled a non-compliant user for installing unauthorized equipment. They didn't even realize I wasn't using their network. They thought they were flexing their authority. But all they did was switch off a panel that disconnected their own access and most of the neighborhoods along with mine. And here's the kicker, they still had no idea I was the one behind the tower. No clue, they had just pulled the plug on themselves. Let me back up a bit so you understand just how wild this situation really was. I moved into this neighborhood a few years ago, mostly because it looked peaceful and had decent infrastructure. But I quickly realized the HOA here wasn't your average neighborhood group. They loved their rules paint colors, mailbox height, even what kind of lawn chairs you could have. I usually kept my head down and stayed out of their way. But when I noticed the internet speeds in the area were garbage and unreliable, especially during storms, I decided to fix that. I work in tech, so I partnered with a small ISP to build a private signal relay tower on a nearby plot I owned. It wasn't flashy, just a small setup that quietly boosted internet to several homes, including mine. Over time, more people started using it. I didn't even charge much. I just wanted reliable service and helped a few neighbors who were struggling with remote work and school. Even the HOA office started routing their service through it. Funny thing is, they never even asked where the improved signal was coming from. Typical. Fast forward to the storm night. I later found out that during a board meeting, yes, they actually held a meeting while the power flickered and trees nearly came down. Someone suggested they shut down unnecessary bandwidth drains. Apparently, I'd been labeled a non-compliant user for installing unauthorized equipment. They didn't even realize I wasn't using their network. They thought they were flexing their authority. But all they did was switch off a panel that disconnected their own access and most of the neighborhood. Along with mine. And here's the kicker, they still had no idea I was the one behind the tower. No clue they had just pulled the plug on themselves. It was one of those nights you don't forget. Thunder cracking over the neighborhood, rain coming down like a waterfall, and the wind howling like a warning. With the storm knocking trees sideways, I did what any smart person would do. I stayed inside, made some coffee, and turned on the news to keep an eye on what was happening. But right as they started talking about flooding in the area, my screen froze. No signal. Then my phone lost Wi-Fi. I checked the router. Everything seemed fine. But somehow, I was completely cut off. No internet. In the middle of a storm now? I wouldn't be this annoyed if it had been a power issue or weather damage. But when I checked with my neighbor across the street, his internet was perfectly fine. Mine was the only one down. That's when I got suspicious. And sure enough, a quick look at the security cameras showed something that made my jaw drop. Earlier that afternoon while I was at work, the HOA maintenance crew had come onto my property and disconnected my internet cable. No notice, no warning. Just unplugged me from the grid like they had every right to do it. Here's where it gets interesting and where the HOA clearly had no idea what they were messing with. You see, I don't just get my internet like everyone else on the block. I own the private relay tower at the top of the hill behind our houses. That's right, the very tower that provides half the neighborhood with their connection. Mine and the entitled folks on the HOA board just picked the worst possible time to mess with it. So what happened when they realized who actually controlled their precious signal? Well, they weren't ready for what came next to really understand how all this went sideways. You need to know a bit about my setup and the HOA. I work remotely in IT and live in a semi-rural neighborhood where the standard internet providers are, well, terrible. Slow speeds, outages, constant buffering, it just wasn't cutting it. So about 2 years ago, I invested in a private relay tower. It wasn't cheap, but it gave me fast, reliable internet through a dedicated signal. Few neighbors even pitched in, and I let them connect through it for a small fee. It was a win-win for everyone, or so I thought. Now, our HOA has always had this weird superiority complex. They think they own the whole community, down to the color of our mailboxes. Petty rules, surprise fines, even complaints about lawn chairs being too visible from the streets nonstop. And for some reason, they've always had a problem with my tower. At one point, they even sent a letter saying it was an eyesore, even though it's barely visible unless you go looking for it. I appealed, proved it was on private land and met all zoning codes, and thought that was the end of it. But clearly, some grudges don't go away. Turns out, during the storm, one of the HOA board members decided it was the perfect time to cut the cable running to my router box, claiming it was a hazard. Really? In the middle of a storm? When people depend on internet access for emergency alerts? The nerve of that move honestly floored me. And here's where it gets shady. The board never contacted me. No calls, no emails, no emergency notice. Just silence and a disconnected cable. But what they didn't expect was that by taking me offline, they'd be taking themselves offline too. And the fallout was just beginning. By the next morning, things had taken a turn. My phone lit up with texts from neighbors, some angry, some confused. Their internet had gone down overnight, right when they needed it most. With the storm still raging and power flickering in and out, they were suddenly cut off from weather updates, emergency notifications, even work meetings. A few folks couldn't access their home security systems. People were panicking. And I was still sitting there with no clue what the HOA was planning next. I didn't say anything at first. I wanted to see how far they'd go. I quietly drove up to the tower site, still standing, still humming, but completely shut out from my main hub. I could tell someone had tampered with the access panel at the base. They didn't know how the whole system worked, but they clearly thought cutting my cable would kill the signal. What they didn't realize was the way the system was set up. It rerouted through my property to reach the rest of the network. So by disconnecting me, they had basically unplugged everyone. And here's where the story gets even messier. One of my neighbors, Susan, called me in a panic. Her elderly mom uses a medical alert device that relies on Wi-Fi backup if the landline fails. That night, it failed. She was furious, not just scared. Another neighbor, James, works from home, managing a team overseas. His connection dropped in the middle of a critical deadline. Now, people were asking questions. Why did only half the neighborhood lose internet? Why did the other half stay online? And why did it all seem to trace back to my house? Meanwhile, the HOA was suspiciously quiet. No apology, no update, nothing. It was like they hoped no one would trace it back to them. But that silence. It was about to explode because I had receipts, cameras, and something they didn't know yet. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the backbone of their connection. By midweek, the neighborhood was buzzing offline and angry. The HOA had dug themselves into a hole, but they were still pretending everything was normal. I stayed quiet, but behind the scenes, I was pulling together the timeline. The footage from my security cameras clearly showed the maintenance guy, wearing an HOA vest, on my property without permission, snipping the line. A few frames later, he was on a phone call, nodding as if following orders. That gave me chills. Someone high up told him to do it. This wasn't a random mistake, it was planned. Meanwhile, the complaints kept rolling in. Susan had filed a formal grievance with the HOA. James was threatening legal action for lost work. Others started connecting the dots, how all the internet problems seemed to start when my cable was cut. I didn't have to say much. The truth was bubbling up all on its own. Then came the meeting. The HOA called an emergency board session, supposedly to address recent service disruptions. I showed up early, sat quietly in the back, and watched the board squirm. The president of the HOA, Mr. Ellison, looked more nervous than usual. I could tell they were trying to spin the situation. They blamed the storm, claimed it was unfortunate timing. But when a neighbor asked directly if they had cut any cables as a precaution, Ellison paused just a little too long. That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I just calmly asked if the board was aware they had damaged equipment they didn't own, equipment tied to a private network. And then I dropped it. The tower was mine. The connection died. Interfered with. I had the license, the data, and the legal paperwork. The room went silent. Faces went pale. I hadn't even shown them the video yet, and they had no idea what was coming next, just when the room thought things couldn't get any worse for the HOA. I pulled out one more card, something even I hadn't planned on using unless they tried to deny everything. I calmly reached into my bag, pulled out a printed document, and slid it across the table to Mr. Ellison. It was a copy of the contract signed 2 years ago, when the HOA had actually approached me for a service extension deal. That's right, they once asked for stronger internet coverage for common areas like the clubhouse and pool surveillance system. And instead of paying a provider, they quietly agreed to tap into my network under the radar. without informing the rest of the community. The board members looked at each other, realizing I'd just exposed something bigger than a cable being cut. This wasn't just about a petty grudge anymore. It was about the HOA knowingly damaging infrastructure they relied on and then trying to bury it. Some homeowners in the room gasped, recognizing the document format as official HOA paperwork. I didn't need to say anything more. The expressions said it all, and then came the twist I hadn't seen coming. A woman from the back of the room stood up. I'd seen her around, usually quiet, always polite. She introduced herself as Linda, a former board secretary who'd stepped down months ago. She cleared her throat and said, "There's more. You're not the only one they've targeted." Suddenly, the spotlight wasn't just on MIT, was on years of buried tension. She claimed the board had a history of going after homeowners who challenged them, manipulating rules, and even editing meeting notes to erase objections. Now, the atmosphere in that meeting wasn't just tense, it was volatile. The community wasn't just upset about the internet outage anymore. They were beginning to realize they'd been played for much longer than one stormy night. And this time, no quiet apology would fix it.